Chapter 9, Hell in Honduras. The runaway at Toncontin Airport in Honduras basically amounted to an oversized driveway crammed into the middle of a narrow valley, surrounded closely on all sides by jagged mountain outcrops. During final approach, pilots had to carefully thread their planes through the Rocky Mountain peaks before exiting an abrupt hairpin turn just prior to touching down. With a death grip on the seat's armrest, Santini peeked nervously out the window and watched as the airliner's wings seemed to soar just inches over the rooftops and TV antennas atop ragged houses along hillsides surrounding the city. His stomach churned and worried he might vomit. After what felt like an eternity, the plane finally kissed the ground and rolled to a stop at the terminal. Santini grabbed his bag and headed through the concourse, straight for the Honduran immigration office. There he spotted a short, heavy-set man, accompanied by another, thinner man. Although the huskier one looked slightly disheveled, with a scuffy beard and messy hair, Santini guessed they were both law enforcement officers from the way they were dressed. Merrell shoes and 511 brand cargo pants, standard street apparel for plainclothes cops across much of the globe. The two, in fact, were Honduras-based HSI agents, or special agents, Oscar Tapia and Alvin Ortega, who were waiting to greet him. HSI had agents posted worldwide in 67 countries to facilitate international investigations for the agency. "You guys fly out here often?" Santini asked after the three men shook hands. "Seems like a suicide mission just getting off and on the ground." "You get used to it," Tapia said, grinning. From the airport, the three agents sped off together in an unmarked car through the streets of whatever that word is. Let's just say Tegalpa. Watching the city stroll by, Santini was struck by the fact that almost every small retail business seemed to have security guards posted out front, armed with shotguns. It was evident the street crime was pervasive in Honduras, known unofficially as the murder capital of the world. The business owners here were taking lots of precautions to protect their properties. The brutal civil war was just across the border in El Salvador, had ended more than 10 years ago in 1992, with an estimated 75,000 people killed, prompting a pullout by the U.S. military from Honduras. But living conditions in the region still had not improved. Over 1 million people were displaced by the conflict, and many of them headed north across Mexico and to the United States to escape. In both El Salvador and Honduras, the governments were both still controlled by repressive militaries, and the lines between military police and between police and criminals were blurry at best. In addition to conducting a due diligence investigation on Diego, the purpose of Santini's trip and his meeting with the special prosecutor and the head of Honduran National Police was largely diplomatic. Since Honduran law enforcement personnel seemed to like to rub shoulders with their American counterparts, Santini's higher-ups hoped his smoozing would pay off with full cooperation from the HNP gang unit. HSI wanted a workable, ongoing relationship, not just for this investigation of 20th Street in San Francisco, but also for future cases involving other Central American gangs operating throughout the United States. After a brief courtesy visit with HNP's special prosecutor of the Organized Crimes Prosecution Unit, as well as with the head of the HNP's National Criminal Investigations Directorate, DNIC, Santini and his two escorts headed for DNIC's main precinct in Tegucigalpa. Here they met with Inspector Diego Mendoza, a nationally recognized expert on street gangs in Honduras. If anyone could shed light on the background and criminal history of Santini's informant Diego, it would be Mendoza and his team of gang officers. Mendoza was young and personable. However, Santini knew that despite his age, he was a seasoned officer. He spoke of gangs and gang violence in almost scientific terms, with a solid background in criminal justice theory. After a brief history of gang proliferation in Honduras, as well as the current state of affairs, Mendoza introduced Santini to about 8 other detectives who worked in the gang-infested barrios of Tegucigalpa. All of them were in their early 30s or mid-20s. They looked to Santini like a bunch of ragtag cops wearing old, unholstered handguns tucked into their waistbands, extra ammunition magazines stuffed into their back pockets, and handcuffs hanging from their belts. Despite their hand-me-down gear, they looked to be genuinely hardened by the real dangers that they faced on the streets every day. With long hair tied in a ponytail and just a few whiskers on his face that made him look like he had just reached puberty, Inspector Mateo Sancido was a 27-year-old officer with about 5 years of police experience. He invited Santini to sit with him at a table at the station room, where he had shared a file on Diego prepared in the weeks prior to Santini's visit. The report contained just a few pages of basic bio information, none of it revealing anything Santini didn't already know. It did at least confirm what Diego had told Santini about his past. Many of the important details Diego had relayed were verified, including where he lived and grew up, his family lineage, as well as the tragic deaths of his father, brother, and sister. This was a relief to Santini, since it gave Diego more credibility as a potential informant and future prosecution witness. How well are you able to develop good sources of intel on the gangs here in Honduras? Santini asked Salcido. It is very difficult, the local cop said, because of the risk involved for both our officers and the informants. The most valuable tools for gang cops in Honduras, he told Santini with a bitter laugh, were their balaclavas, or concealment masks, which were used to cover their faces during field operations. The gang cops often lived near the same neighborhoods they policed, and deadly retribution was almost certain if they were identified. Even worse, the level of police corruption here was such that police officers had to be just as wary of their fellow cops as they were of the thugs. One could never be certain about who within their ranks might be taking bribes and passing intelligence to the gangs. One good thing, Salcido confided, we do have a new informant. He told Santini that his unit had begun grooming a promising young source just in the past week, the girlfriend of a gang leader in the Colonia 3, the Mayo neighborhood of Daglupla. She had agreed to cooperate with HNP after seeing one of her friends murdered by the gang. The experience had scared her straight and she wanted out of the life. She's 19 years old and muy bonita, Castro Ramos said. In 2000, MS-13 began solidifying its hierarchy in Honduran prisons as a result of the efforts of high-ranking gang members in its US-based cliques. According to Diego, while he was in prison at La Granja, the farm, a gang member named Power visited with... According to Diego, while he was in prison in La Granja, the farm, a gang member named Power visited senior MS-13 members behind bars on 4 separate occasions to disseminate 40 new rules for the gang, almost all of which carried the death penalty for disobedience. MS-13 was becoming increasingly violent toward even its own members during this time, and many individuals were green-lighted for murder by the big homies. In La Granja, Diego witnessed numerous killings, including the decapitation and mutilation of an MS-13 member during a gang meeting. He was next on deck to be killed that day in similar fashion, but was saved at the last minute by a high-ranking gang member who stepped in and declared him to be clean. In May 2003, toward the end of Diego's incarceration at La Granja, after a weapons search of the facility conducted by police with the help of inmate trustees turned up various makeshift killing devices, the gang members were confined to their cells as punishment. 2 days later, a leader of the gang and some of his homies confronted a non-gang member inmate whom they blamed for tipping off guards about their hidden weapons. A fight broke out and a trustee was killed. That's where the official story diverged dramatically from what some of the gang members who survived the ensuing massacre reported happening. According to the statements made to a local newspaper by an 18th Street gang member who was present for the battle, he was standing on the prison's basketball court when the fight broke out. He heard gunshots coming from a nearby cell used by the trustees as an unofficial office. The police stormed in with automatic weapons and the gang members retreated to their cells, leaving the dead prisoner's body and another badly injured inmate lying on the prison yard. It was then, the 18th Street member said, that police began to shoot at gang members who were holed up in their cells, hitting him with a bullet that broke his arm. With the help of some trustees, the police then started a raging fire, trapping 40 prisoners in a cell and engulfing them in flames. When it was over, 69 gang members lay dead and another 39 were seriously injured. Burnt corpses and legs, arms, and teeth of dismembered bodies were strewn across the prison grounds. One police officer was injured. Within hours of the massacre, Ricardo Maduro, then president of Honduras, arrived at the prison to survey the ghastly scene. Maduro's own son had been kidnapped and murdered by MS-13 members 4 years earlier, giving him a plausible motive for revenge. Standing among the dead and wounded, the president promised there would be a full investigation of what had happened at the prison that day. Families of the dead prisoners who thought they might get some honest official accounting of what occurred during the slaughter were still waiting for it 15 years later. It was this horrendous environment that piqued Santini's interest in taking a prison tour while setting up his itinerary for the trip. The day after his meeting with the DNIC, Santini was met by Anthony Breslin, the State Department's International Narcotics Affairs and Law Enforcement (INL) program liaison. INL funneled money into policing projects in countries suffering from rampant corruption. Breslin had been a great resource for Santini by telephone leading up to his trip, assisting HSI to grease the skids with Honduran officials prior to the agent's arrival. It was a 34-mile drive north up the Del Norte freeway through the mountains to the National Penitentiary located in Tamar, Honduras. They drove through the La Colonia Maria Jose, alleged to be one of the most crime-ridden areas outside the capital. Along the way, they passed the Santa Cruz Memorial, a roadside cemetery centered around a large sandstone statue of the Savior bearing his cross. From a distance, the prison appeared as a campus of administrative buildings surrounded by a white stone wall. Santini was led by prison officials through a 20-foot high iron gate into a yard at the Marco Soto Ward. The wall's interior was painted with 3 large skulls. The one on the left had 2 skeleton hands covering its ears, the middle one covering its eyes, and the third covering its mouth. Underneath the skulls, an inscription read, "No oigo, no miro, no hablo," or "I do not hear, I do not see, I do not speak," an apparent warning to all who entered the yard that gang rules applied here. It was the mantra of the Mata 18 gang housed at the Marco Soto cell block. There was no place in the yard for a rat. Mata 18, or 18th Street, was the arch nemesis of MS-13 in Honduras and all Central America. Although Santini had spent the morning driving with his host from INL with the intent of touring the MS-13 wing of the prison, the warden had a different plan. He considered the current state of the MS-13 housing section too decrepit and dangerous for an American visitor to walk through. Instead, they were given a bird's eye view of 18th Street section in a newer, safer wing of the prison. In sharp contrast to U.S. prisons, which were generally painted in amateurish graffiti, the Marco Saddle facility was covered wall to wall with gang murals that looked as if they were painted by a team of accomplished artists. As the American visitors worked their way through the yard and into the depths of the holding cells, it seemed every wall in the facility had been touched by the gang's brushes. Every corner and crevice seemed to have graffiti with the letter-style marking and symbol. Santini stood in front of the tractor-trailer-sized painting of a graveyard depicting 7 tombstones with the inscription, "For my homies," written above in cursive. Each tombstone was covered with a long list of dead gang members' names. It became blatantly obvious to Santini that the Marreros ran the Tamara prison. If the graffiti didn't tell the story, the slipshod security, even the timid looks on the guards' faces said it all. This was a prison run by gangs, with a corrections force of puppets who did what they were told. When Mendoza picked up Santini the next day to take him to the airport for his return flight to San Francisco, he handed the HSI agent the morning edition of the local El Diario newspaper. Santini glanced at a photo on the front page that showed a large cardboard box deposited the night before in the plaza of the La Esperanza. This was the same neighborhood where Salcido's new informant lived, the beautiful young gang member he mentioned to Santini during his visit a couple days before at the HMP office. As Santini struggled to read the El Diario article with his limited knowledge of Spanish, Mendoza explained the cardboard box was discovered to contain the mutilated body of a young woman who had been brutally tortured. Salcido's pretty new informant, the one who wanted out of the gang life, had been ratted out, likely by an insider at the DNC. Salcido's pretty new informant, the one who wanted out of the gang life, had been ratted out, likely by an insider at DNIC, and murdered by the gang's thugs. Her breast and nose were cut off and numerous gang insignia had been carved into her flesh. A note scribbled in black marker and taped to the top of the box read, "No oigo, no miro, no hablo."